Welcome to Relationships, Part 2 of a perspective on It's Never Ever Really an Accident. In Part 1, I talked about a couple of foundational relationships that could exist between two entities. Either one entity adds to or changes the other in the same direction or in the opposite direction, with an example. These two relationships can be used to create two very basic structures that occur across all of the relationship models you will ever develop. The first one being what's called a reinforcing structure. As an example, take the principal in a savings account. Periodically, that generates interest. So if the principal increases, the interest is larger in that period. And once the interest is created, that adds to the principal. Now notice that these two relationships are both plus signs, but one is the same direction, because if the principal gets larger, the interest gets larger, principal gets smaller, interest gets smaller. So it's a same direction relationship. Principal is an accumulation of something. Interest is just a value. It's an amount of something that's created and moves, and it adds to the principal as opposed to changing in the same direction. Because if the interest gets larger, it adds more to the principal. But if it gets smaller, it still adds to the principal, it's just not so much. So this is a reinforcing structure where some activity creates more of something, which encourages more of the same result, and it creates an exponential growth structure. The alternative form of this is one where you still have a reinforcing structure, but it's a reinforcing decline where some entity subtracts from something else, and that causes something to change in the opposite direction. So it's an exponential decline structure. But again, we have a subtracts from in an opposite direction. And the Cold War, I believe, is a good example of this, because the Cold War subtracts from trust, and trust causes the Cold War to change in the opposite direction. So as trust declines, Cold War increases. And if trust increases, the Cold War would decrease. So this is an exponential decline structure, but they're both reinforcing structures. The second kind of structure is called a balancing or goal-seeking structure, where you have some current value, some desired value, and it's the difference between those two values. There's a gap, and that gap is the impetus for some kind of action intended to move the current state in the direction of the desired state. So that if I have an empty bathtub and I want a full bathtub, there's a large gap between the two of them, and that influences me to add water. The water that I add actually adds to the level in the tub. So the tub is an accumulation. And then when I add water to it, the gap gets smaller. So for each cycle that I make, the gap gets smaller and smaller, and I add water. And finally, the current level reaches a desired level, and the gap is zero, and the goal is reached. So it's a goal-seeking structure. The exponential growth, and the goal-seeking structure are the only two structures that exist. No matter how complex or apparently complicated your relationship models may become, they are only some combination of these two structures. Now, admittedly, there may be a dozen elements in the loop, but you can tell the difference between the two structures if you walk the loop and you count the number of subtracts from or opposite direction influences. And if that is odd, it's a balancing loop. If it's even, it's a reinforcing structure. So if you walk this loop, there's one. It's an odd number of opposite subtracts from relationships, so it's a goal seeking. There are none here, so it's even, and there are two here, so it's even. So they're both reinforcing structures. So as you begin to look at more and more relationship models, I expect that this will become second nature, even if it's a little cryptic at the moment. A couple of words of wisdom that I thought were worth sharing after numerous years of enduring the pain that I created for myself by not following my own advice is don't hesitate to add clarification. Put notes in the relationship model wherever you think that it might aid to your audience's understanding. You need to remember that they were not there with you when you created the model. So much of the things that you understand that aren't explicitly there and labeled, your audience won't be able to infer just from looking at the model. The element labels use positive non-directional terms or phrases. Whether an element increases or decreases is evident based upon the influences that are connected to it, so that you don't want to talk about increasing revenue or decreasing lifespan, or you want lifespan or revenue, or positive non-directional terms. Always label your loops. If the loops are not labeled, the model simply isn't done. A model represents a story that conveys a way that things evolve over time. And if you don't label and sequence the loops, other people don't know what order to read the story in. How much sense would a play make if they give you the acts of the play in some shuffled order? If there's any chance that the audience might not find the relationships between two entities obvious, you can actually put a label on the relationship itself, and you can add comments in the relationship. And as I said, you want to sequence the loops so people understand what order to look at them. If it's a growth loop, an exponential growth loop, indicate what it is that the loop is causing to grow so that your audience doesn't have to try and figure it out. And balancing loops always have an explicit goal, so ensure that the label on the goal-seeking loop indicates what the goal is. And where there are delays in the structure, be sure that you indicate, such as this, that there are delays between here and here in the time frame, so that it's not an instantaneous change. So that's really all there is to developing meaningful relationship diagrams. Well, that and a lot of trial and learning and developing them and working on them and tearing them up and throwing them away and starting over again. And many of the diagrams that you will see in the coming weeks will look like they're well thought out, though they're the result of numerous iterations of trial and learning in terms of working on the relationships and trying to figure out what is a sensible way of unfolding the story, and throwing things away and doing it over and over and over again. So hope you found this meaningful, and I'll see you in another perspective shortly. Bye.